I just moved into this house in the city. It felt like it was wiping away every trace of my past, leaving behind a vague sense of loneliness. Everything was so new, the rooms, the walls, even the air itself. A few boxes were still scattered in the corners, but hey, everything would fall into place eventually, right? After Earl, everything sort of vanished. It was such a rough time that I sometimes lost track of how the days passed. But now, 5 years later, I had to leave the past behind and start over. So I moved. This house, while not a massive change, was a constant reminder that I needed to pull myself together. But let me tell you, nothing about it was easy. The electricity kept cutting in and out. I tried to fix it, but I'm not exactly handy in that department. Being alone in the dark, I hadn't felt this lonely since those old days. Wilfred, he's always been a good kid, raised by his mom. But when it comes to fixing electrical stuff, I don't know anyone better. "Auntie, just call me anytime and I'll come right over," he said last week with a grin. I wasn't sure when I'd need him, but I ended up having to reach out sooner than I thought. I texted him, "Wilfred, the electricity keeps acting up. Can you come and take a look, please? I can't figure this out on my own. It's such a big house, and I'm struggling here all alone." His reply came quickly, like it always did, quick and straight to the point. "On my way, Auntie. Be there soon." If you love hearing real interesting stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe to my channel, and watch until the end. Hit that like button too, it really helps me keep sharing these powerful stories. Trust me, this is one you don't want to miss. Suddenly, my heart skipped a beat. Seeing Wilfred actually gave me a strange sense of comfort. Odd as it sounds, he was such a familiar face from years back, but now he was also someone different, grown, mature, changed. He was young, sure, but he carried himself like a full-fledged adult. From that day on, every time he came over, something shifted. After a while, I started checking the old lamps carefully placed by the window, and fiddling with the nearly broken electrical appliances around the house. Every now and then, I'd hear Wilfred's footsteps approaching from outside. Everything felt different now, even just glancing at him meant something entirely new. I barely recognized myself anymore. A few minutes later, I heard a knock at the door. I hesitated for a second, then opened it. He smiled instantly. "Hey Auntie, how's it going? Still having trouble with the electricity?" His eyes didn't have that boyish sparkle they used to. Gone was the little kid from all those years ago. Standing in front of me was a man, mature and grounded. But even so, I could still feel something in his gaze. "Oh Wilfred, I don't know what to do anymore. Everything's a mess. The power's out half the time, and there's an issue in every corner of this house. So I called you. Can you help me?" I said with a small smile. He took a deep breath and joked, "Don't worry, Auntie, I can fix this in a few hours. Besides, I know you're hopeless when it comes to electrical stuff." Knowing we'd tackle this together gave me a sudden sense of peace. I wasn't alone, Wilfred was here. Even though I felt like a stranger in this small house after all these years, somehow that familiar, comforting feeling was still there. When Wilfred walked in, he scanned the room for a few seconds. His eyes quickly swept over the place, locking onto the electrical panel, but I noticed his gaze linger somewhere else for just a moment. The skirt I was wearing was a bit short and hugged my figure. My red hair fell loosely over my shoulders as it always did, and these days my go-to outfit of comfy tights and mini skirts had become my thing. I wanted to feel comfortable in this house, but I also wasn't neglecting myself entirely. Maybe it was a little gift to myself after losing Earl, a reminder that I still deserved to feel good. Staying fit and taking care of myself had become a part of my routine. Wilfred's eyes drifted almost unconsciously to the hem of my skirt before snapping back. He quickly refocused on the panel, checking it with a concentration that felt almost deliberate. I stepped closer, trying to show I appreciated how seriously he was taking the job, but there was a slight tension in the air. The easy, familiar vibe we'd had just minutes earlier now seemed a little off. "Let me check these wires," he said, pulling his hands out of his pockets and opening the panel cover. He carefully examined each connection, and I couldn't help but watch him. My eyes followed the way he moved, how focused he was, the look of concentration on his face. But then it hit me, maybe I was watching him a little too closely, like I was a stranger in my own home, observing him from some odd distance. As Wilfred moved closer, he stopped by the fridge and said, "This looks old too." He placed his hand on top of it, and for some reason, seeing his hands slightly sweaty made me uneasy. The close proximity made everything feel more intense. When he took another step, bending down to check the plugs behind the fridge, I felt a strange warmth on my back. My mind was swirling, but at the same time, I tried to focus on all the other tasks I needed to do. "I think the issue isn't here, just checking the electrical panel should be enough," I said, trying not to overanalyze the moment. But truthfully, my heart was beating a little faster. Eventually, Wilfred finished his careful inspection and made his way back to the kitchen. "All done, looks like everything's good now," he said. "Thank you so much," I replied with a small smile. In that moment, I realized how many complicated feelings were hiding behind that simple smile. Wilfred had done his job, and now all that was left was for me to stand there in the room. But as he smiled back at me, preparing to leave, I thought I saw something else in his eyes, something unspoken. "I'll get going then." "I'm glad I could help," he said, heading for the door. As he opened it, he turned to look at me one last time. For a brief moment, I wanted to say something, maybe something as simple as "I'm glad you came," but no words came out of my mouth. Wilfred gave a final nod before closing the door behind him and stepping outside. With his departure, all the emotions of that moment seemed to dissipate as if they had never been there. Yet, I was left with an emptiness inside, unsure of exactly what I was feeling. His leaving took the charged atmosphere of the moment with it, leaving behind a strange quiet. Wilfred's demeanor and the fact that I kept calling him over seemed at first like it was just about him helping out with work. But over time, I started to notice that he was paying a little extra attention to me. He spoke to me with warmth, throwing in compliments here and there. "No matter how old you are, those kinds of looks and kind words always feel good, don't they?" And Wilfred's looks, they were the kind that stirred something inside me, a spark I hadn't felt in a long time. At first, I tried to act like I didn't feel anything, but those looks, those little compliments, they can mess with your heart. Yeah, maybe I was well aware of my age, but still, I couldn't deny there was some kind of pull toward him. I kept trying to hold back, but every time my eyes locked with his, I felt something shift. The electrical problems in the house had become something I was used to. The power went out a few times a week. At first it was annoying, but over time, I learned to live with it. Today was one of those days. By evening, I had wrapped up a few chores, feeling somewhat at ease as I moved around the kitchen prepping for dinner. Every corner of the house still carried the quirks of being new to me, strange sounds, unfamiliar creaks. But with every step, I felt like it was slowly getting used to me. I was wearing a red lace nightgown at the time, elegant yet cozy, made from a soft light fabric that kept me warm. The mini skirt cut always made me feel comfortable. After all, shouldn't a woman feel stylish and relaxed at the same time? A light breeze brushed my back, outlining the curves of my body, while the lace seemed to ghost over my skin like it had a mind of its own. In that moment, I felt peaceful but also acutely aware of something missing. Maybe it was the closeness of Wilfred, who was always there to help me out when I needed it. Wilfred was handy with electrical work, a real pro at fixing these kinds of problems. That's why it felt so natural to call him whenever something went wrong. And bless him, he always showed up quickly whenever I asked. When the power went out again, I wasn't surprised, but the moment the light flickered back on, a strange tension filled the air. Suddenly, smoke began rising from inside my fridge. My eyes widened as I stared at it, my heart pounding. Was this something serious this time? I grabbed my phone and quickly. KLY sent a message to Wilfred, the power's out again, and now my fridge is acting up. There's smoke coming out of it. Can you help me? Seeing his quick reply brought me a little relief. On my way. Don't worry, I'll be there in a few minutes, he wrote. I took a deep breath. On one hand, I was worried, but on the other, it was hard to pass the time until he arrived without overthinking everything. There was a flutter inside me, something I couldn't quite put into words, but it grew stronger the closer it got to Wilfred showing up. My mind was racing with thoughts. A little while later, Wilfred walked in, holding his phone in one hand. He headed straight to the fridge and got to work, moving around the kitchen like he owned the place. Meanwhile, I sat down on a chair, trying to calm myself. I crossed my legs, watching the shadows dance in the dim corners of the room. I could feel the tension in my chest, the way my heart was beating faster as Wilfred worked. I caught him stealing glances at me. Sure, he was focused on the job, but somehow his attention kept drifting toward me. His eyes would flicker my way over and over again. Every time he looked, I felt something inside me rise like a wave, building in intensity. Those looks, I didn't want them to stop, but at the same time, a small voice in the back of my mind questioned what I was doing and where this was all going. Still, there was something there, a pull I couldn't ignore, and it was far from ordinary. Just then, the power went out again. Everything went dark in an instant. A mix of fear and excitement surged through me when the light from the fridge disappeared. The room was plunged into an even deeper darkness. The faint glow from my phone screen lit up just enough to make out the surroundings, but the silence that followed made my heart race even faster. Wilfred turned on his phone's flashlight and started checking the fridge's plug. I kept watching him, trying to figure out what was going on, but as I sat there on the chair, my legs crossed, I realized my position might have shown just a little more than I intended. Sure enough, I caught Wilfred glancing at me again. After fiddling with the fridge for a bit, he straightened up and looked at me. Taking a deep breath, he said, "I think this is causing an issue with the breaker box. Let's check the panel. This one might be a bit trickier." I nodded in agreement. "All right then, I'd appreciate your help." Wilfred grabbed his toolbox and stood up. "I'll need you to hold your phone's flashlight for me. We'll have to head down to the basement, and it's going to be dark." I quickly pulled out my phone and turned on the flashlight. Wilfred started walking ahead, and I followed him closely. The floor was a bit slippery, though, and while I was focused on holding the light steady, I got distracted for a second and dropped my phone. As soon as I noticed it hit the ground, I bent down to pick it up, but in my rush, I didn't pay attention to anything else. I naturally leaned forward, and for a moment, all I could think about was grabbing the phone. It felt like everything slowed down as I crouched down on my knees. The hem of my miniskirt lifted slightly, and there was this strange pull, like my body was moving on its own without me realizing. I could hear Wilfred's footsteps behind me, but I wasn't paying much attention. Suddenly, he bumped into my back. Startled, I looked up, but the impact left me feeling weightless for a second, like I was floating. It was as if this moment held some kind of strange, unspoken connection, and I could sense that something between us had shifted. As I grabbed my phone, I noticed Wilfred leaning in slightly in the dim light. Taking a deep breath, I couldn't fully process what was happening, but the whole thing left me feeling strangely affected. Wilfred moved past me gently and said, "Be careful with your phone," but the tension in his voice made his words mean something more. My head was spinning, and even in the dark, the feelings seemed to intensify. I stood up slowly and followed him as we continued down to the basement. As we walked down the basement stairs, I was still holding my phone, but once again, in my clumsiness, I dropped it. This time, though, the flashlight turned off completely. I bent down to pick it up, being way more cautious now. That's when I realized the phone was broken. "My phone's broken," I said, my voice echoing in the darkness. I tried looking for Wilfred, but my eyes couldn't adjust, and focusing became harder and harder. Out of nowhere, I bumped into him, his solid frame collided with me, and I stumbled backward, completely off balance. Just as I was about to hit the ground, I felt myself land somewhere secure. Wilfred had caught me in his arms, holding me steady. I opened my eyes slowly, my breathing rapid, and for a brief moment, the entire world around me went silent. In the dark, the only sound was the rhythm of our breathing. Then, as the power suddenly came back on, the room was flooded with light. My phone might have been broken, but in that moment, I felt like I'd fallen into a completely different world. Wilfred's body was still close to mine, his arms still holding me. My mind was a mess, but the rush of excitement and tension inside me was louder than anything else. Something had shifted inside me. What had just happened? Why had it happened? I didn't have the answers, but all I knew was that there was this strange sense of security mixed with confusion in Wilfred's arms. When the lights flickered back on, lighting up the room, our eyes locked. There was still a shadow of the moment we shared in the dark, but with the lights on, the weight of it felt even heavier. His arms were still around my waist, holding me, and the silence between us made the air thicker, more intense. My heart was pounding, and it felt like there was a knot in my throat. We were so close, so connected, that it felt like time had slowed down to act before my mind could catch up, and all the complicated feelings inside me started bubbling over. My eyes stayed fixed on Wilfred's, and the space between us seemed to shrink with every passing second. I had no idea how much time had passed or what thoughts were racing through my mind, but one thing was clear: there was a pull in his eyes directed at me, and I felt it too. I was struggling to keep control of myself because every moment, every glance, every touch felt more intense. Finally, without knowing what I was waiting for or what would happen next, Wilfred's lips moved closer to mine. That moment, brief as it was, felt like it carried the weight of an ending and a beginning all at once. His lips brushed against mine in a kiss that sent a shiver through my entire body. It was short but powerful, like a jolt. We stumbled back, landing against some old furniture in the basement, both of us out of breath. Everything had happened so fast that I couldn't even piece together how we'd gotten there. My hands rested on Wilfred's shoulders, my heart racing in my chest. The moment felt blurred and confusing. The lights being back on made everything around us more visible, but my mind was still a tangled mess. My thoughts clashed with my emotions, echoing in my head. Being this close, letting ourselves get so caught up in the moment, was this even right? His lips were still on mine, his hands still on my body, but something felt off. There was a line, and we definitely crossed it. "Yes, on your step A," I said, closing my eyes and taking a deep breath, trying to steady myself. I had to take a step back to remind myself just how wrong this was, but my heart was still reeling from his closeness, torn between the voice saying this isn't okay, and the pull that kept drawing me toward him. "But what we just did, it was still wrong," I said, my voice shaky but firm, facing the reality of what had just happened and trying to process the whirlwind of emotions. It wasn't easy. Wilfred's eyes stayed locked on mine, filled with an intensity that made it hard to breathe. No matter how far I tried to step back, the pull between us was undeniable, like gravity pulling me into him. I didn't know what would happen next or what steps we'd take from here, but one thing was clear: this moment had changed everything for both of us. Wilfred slowly stepped back, uncertainty clouding his expression. "I know," he said quietly, his voice carrying a serious tone. "But feeling this, being close to you, experiencing this." He trailed off, leaving his words hanging in the air. For a few seconds, there was nothing but silence between us. We just stood there breathing, the closeness between us pressing against everything unspoken. These feelings were beyond our control. Somehow, we had been drawn to each other, but now it had become so much more complicated. Taking a step back and undoing what had just happened wouldn't be easy, and deep down, we both knew that. Afterward, Wilfred quickly left. The power outage. I just stood there, watching him go. The effect of the moment still lingered in my body, but my mind was racing with 1,000 thoughts. My hands were still trembling, my heart pounding like crazy. That night, that darkness, being left alone. Everything happened so fast, so chaotically, that even trying to make sense of it felt impossible. Wilfred's gaze, the warmth of his hands, the red lace nightgown I was wearing, it all blurred together in the silence of the night. I replayed that moment over and over again. No matter how much I regretted it, no matter how much I blamed myself, there was something I couldn't shake, something that wouldn't let me forget those feelings. Being alone in the dark, the power going out, the sudden quiet, Wilfred's closeness, the strange unease of it all. It created this storm inside me. Yeah, deep down, I felt a rush, but it was just the heat of the moment, right? Maybe it was the red lace nightgown I was wearing. Maybe it was the charm of his youth, or maybe it was just us being alone together in the dark that got to me. When the power went out, it felt like the world shrank down to just us, a fleeting coincidence, a misunderstanding, or maybe just an emotional lapse in the moment. And yet, as days passed, I kept thinking about it. Wilfred's intense gaze, the trembling in my hands, the quickened pace of my breath, the panic from the smoke coming from the fridge, and then us getting close in the dark. Was all of this really just a coincidence, or was it all somehow deliberate? I'll never know, but one thing's for sure, I'll never forget that night. Wilfred's youth, my age, the way I looked in that red nightgown, the darkness, the power outage. When all of it came together, I have to admit how special, how impactful that moment was. What happened, but next time, maybe things will never be the same again. That moment will always stay with me. If you've made it this far, I know my story hit you deep. There's so much more to share, and you don't want to miss any of it. Make sure to hit that follow button, turn on notifications, and leave a comment. Comment about this story. I can't wait to hear your thoughts, so let's chat in the comments. Your support means the world to me.